Since I started teaching miniature painting, there are a few key points that keep coming up consistently in my tuition sessions that I think we really should address. These are fundamental behaviours or issues or challenges that are happening with the majority of people. So I feel like it'd be a really good idea to do a video that addresses everything in them that you'll hopefully find useful. Bracing yourself correctly is the most consistent thing that comes up very early on in tuition. Bracing yourself correctly is so important because if you don't do it, first of all, it's going to reduce the accuracy of your painting, but more importantly, it can potentially damage your joints and cause you medical issues in the long run. To start, we want to ideally brace our arms below the elbows against something. In my case, I always brace my arms against the desk. This minimizes the movement from the shoulders and elbows. I appreciate not everyone paints at a desk, so this can be a challenge, especially if you paint on a couch, for example. The goal here is to reduce as much movement as possible from the shoulders and the elbows as possible. The next brace point is the fingers. The brush hand is split in half. The pinky and the ring finger are used to stabilize the hand when painting, while the thumb, index finger and middle finger are used to hold the brush. So when painting, ideally your arms should be braced against something. Your wrist should be floating, so it shouldn't be resting against the model. And your pinky and your ring finger should be resting against the model or your handle. The health of your hands and wrists is incredibly important, more important than a good paint job. The two important points to think about are the position of the wrists and how tight you hold your model and brush. Previously, I said the wrist should float. What I mean by this is it shouldn't be braced against anything, which causes it to sit at a poor angle. You want to keep your wrist at a more natural straight angle to avoid prolonged strain. Now sometimes with detailed work this can't be helped, but we want to minimize the time we put strain on our wrists as much as possible. And the second point is to not squeeze your hands too tight when you're holding your brush or your model. Believe it or not, if you squeeze too tight for too long, you can actually cause strain in your hands and your fingers. And this can cause long-term damage, and I know this from experience. When you're painting, try and keep your hands as relaxed as possible without dropping the model or the brush, obviously. Shaky hands is a really common issue that people have. Now, if you have shaky hands because of a medical issue, naturally, I'm not really qualified to help you with that. But for most people, there's a few things that can be done. Firstly, and I know most of you are probably fed up with hearing about this, but if you have a healthy diet and you sleep enough, it will reduce the shake in your hands. And to be fair, it does make a huge difference. It's not going to be a big deal if you're just doing army painting, but if you're looking at display and competition level painting, this is something that you should probably think about because your health is directly going to influence the outcome of your work. Naturally, bracing makes a big difference. We just talked about how to brace your hands correctly. This is massive. The better you brace, the more stable your hands are going to be and the less of an issue you're going to have. Lastly, and this is the one that makes a big difference to a lot of people, is exhale as you do your brush stroke. A lot of people say that you should hold your breath. I don't agree with this because if you're painting for a long time, you're going to be holding your breath quite a lot and that's not particularly healthy. But if you exhale as you do your brush stroke, your hands will settle and you will have a much more precise mark. This is something that they do in shooting and other sports, so it's really, really useful and something that you should practice. You don't need to do it on every single brush stroke when you're painting, just the detailed ones. The purpose of the palette, regardless of whether you're using a wet palette, a dry palette, or a well palette, and the process of painting between the palette and before you put the brush on that model is not something that's discussed very often and not something that's shown. And the reason for this is because most of the time we're trying to condense our videos and tutorials down to a manageable length, because if it takes us 5 hours to paint something, we don't want to show you a 5-hour video. Now, the problem with that is it's actually an incredibly important part of the process, and it's not one that we talk about enough. The palette itself, as you probably know, is used to manage your paint, but it's much more than that. It's an opportunity to gather as much information about your paint as possible. When you see people online playing with their paint, What they're doing is they're trying to assess the consistency and the behavior of that paint. The issue is most people I see do this without any intention. They do it without understanding why, so they just end up moving paint around for no reason. It almost becomes a habit. Ideally, we want to thin the paint to the consistency we think is correct, remove the excess paint off the brush, as we want to test that same paint under the same circumstances as when we are painting the model. And if your brush is overloaded when you test the paint consistency, that's not a true test of what you're going to do with the model, because you don't want an overloaded brush when you paint the model. So basically what we're doing with the palette is we load the brush up and then we test our paint on the palette or on our hand, whatever you prefer. This way we know exactly what we're getting from our paint, and any issues that we have are going to happen on the palette, not on our model. So we do this to minimize mistakes. The point of removing the paint from the brush is also incredibly important and not always discussed or shown. It's incredibly easy to do this. Load the brush up, halfway up the bristles, remove the excess paint on a piece of tissue by dragging it and rotating the brush until the belly of the brush is no longer overloaded. You can also restore the point of the brush at this point as well. Then test your paint consistency and your brush stroke. We do this every time we paint. So just to recap, the process that you don't always see on camera. We mix our paint on the palette, we load the brush up halfway up the bristles, we remove the excess paint on that kitchen roll, twisting and rotating the brush as we go to restore the point, and so the belly is no longer overloaded. At that point, we go back to either our hand or our palette, and we test the brush mark that's going to happen and make sure that we have a nice brush stroke that we're happy with, and that our paint consistency and opacity is at a level that we are happy with. This happens every time we get more paint on the brush. Every time we reload the brush, we do this process. This is what you don't see in most videos. Lastly, and with so many people, including myself these days, using wet palettes, I see so many people who are leaving their paint on the palette for days or weeks on end and coming back and reusing it. I know it's good to save money and I know it's good to save paint, but if you are going for any high quality painting and you're really trying to improve, you're giving yourself a harder job. The reason for this is because as the paint becomes older, the properties of that paint can change, and sometimes drastically. This can make getting a good result harder, as you need to compensate for the new properties of this paint. So sometimes the paint can separate and almost appear like it curdles. And no matter how much you mix it, sometimes it will not mix the same way as it was originally. There are a few other things that can go wrong with it, but I'm sure if you're making this mistake, then you've probably had some kind of issues with it in the past. It's just a far better option to replace your paint at the beginning of every session. It's not going to waste a huge amount of paint. Just don't put too much paint on the palette in your first place and you'll be absolutely fine. And in regards to a wet palette, I know loads of people seem to think that I hate wet palettes. I don't hate wet palettes. I use one all of the time. But the point of a wet palette is to keep your paint workable during that painting session, not to keep that paint workable for weeks on end.